Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Jordan, and I'd like to welcome you to this lovely space on behalf of the Wheeler Centre tonight. Our guest is William Boyd. He is a novelist of 14 novels, assorted other works of fiction, short stories, plays, a film director and screenplay writer and teacher. I've brought 3 of his novels in tonight. I couldn't manage any more on the train. The one that he's talking about on this tour of Australia is Sweet Caress, his wonderful new work. The other 2 I've grabbed are Restless, which was made into a BBC drama, and the one that you might have read already, Any Human Heart. This is William's first visit to Melbourne, so please join with me in making him welcome.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi, Tony. I'm very pleased to be here. It's a great pleasure. Long overdue visit, but here we are.
Thank you. We thought that you might start us off with a reading from Sweet Caress.
Yes, I thought I would just read one page. Don't panic.
No,
it's just the very first page of the novel, and it's the prologue, in fact. And just to give you a flavour of the book, which we'll probably talk about as the evening winds on, and give you a sense of the protagonist, who's a woman called Amory Clay. And Amory, in her mature years, nearly 70, is reflecting on her life and flashing back, and that's the story of the novel. But this prologue is a significant moment in her life. It's 1916, the middle of the First World War, and she's 8 years old, and her uncle, who's a society photographer, has given her a camera as a present. And this is her memory of her very first photograph, which, as we'll discover, is a highly significant moment. What drew me down there, I wonder, to the edge of the garden? I remember the summer light, the trees, the bushes, the grass luminously green, basted by the bland, benevolent late afternoon sun. So was it light? But there was the laughter also coming from where a group of people had gathered by the pond. Someone must have been horsing around, making everyone laugh. The light and the laughter then. I was in the house, in my bedroom, bored, with the window open wide, so I could hear the chatter of conversation from the guests, and then the sudden arpeggio of delighted laughter came that made me slip off my bed and go to the window to see the gentlemen and the ladies and the marquee and the trestle tables laid out with canapes and punch bowls. I was curious. Why were they all making their way towards the pond? What was the source of this merriment? And so I hurried downstairs to join them. And then, halfway across the lawn, I turned and ran back to the house to fetch my camera. Why did I do that? I think I have an idea now, all these years later. I wanted to capture that moment, that benign congregation in the garden on a warm summer evening in England, to capture it and imprison it forever. Somehow I sensed I could stop time's relentless motion and hold that scene, that split second, with the ladies and the gentlemen in their finery as they laughed, careless and untroubled. I would catch them fast, eternally, thanks to the properties of my wonderful machine. In my hands, I had the power to stop time, or so I fancied.
Thank you, William. So this is a very significant event for Amory when she's 8. So I wanted to actually begin with young child William. Your novels are so quintessentially British, but that's not where you were born.
No, I'm the last in a line, a journalist once said to me, which gave me some pause, because nobody likes to be the last in any line. But I'm a child of the empire, I suppose, of the old colonies, because I was born in West Africa, in what was then a British colony, the Gold Coast, which became Ghana when I was 6, I think. And my father was a doctor, and he worked in Africa all his professional life. And my life was an African life. It wasn't like today, where you might go out somewhere and work for 3 years and come home. My father worked abroad, like many young middle-class professionals of that time, post-World War II. He went out to the colonies and made his life there with his young wife, and she had me and then my 2 sisters. And we lived in Africa as visitors, I suppose, but benevolent ones, not settlers, not owning land. And so my childhood was sort of idyllic in the Gold Coast and then Ghana. It was normal. That's the thing that's extraordinary, I think. It's not like you're a tourist or somebody who's lived in the country for a while. The exoticism of Africa was completely run-of-the-mill to me. It sounds paradoxical, but what I did and what I saw and experienced was part of my daily life. And then, politics of African countries took over, and Ghana began to become unstable. And so my parents thought, well, let's move to another African country in West Africa, Nigeria. 3 military coups and a civil war later, they thought, well, maybe we should have stayed put. But actually, for me, Nigeria was, because I was a teenager by then, was an extraordinary place to live. And I loved my Nigerian childhood and adolescence and youth. I didn't leave there until I was in my 20s, early 20s. So the first, third of my life was an African one, even though I was sent back to Scotland to a boarding school, as all kids were. My home was Africa. That was a place I knew best. And I know it shaped me as a person, and therefore it must have shaped me as a writer. I've written at least 3 novels set in Africa, but it's more a question of your sensibility that's shaped, I think. And I don't want to overanalyze it, but I'm sure I'm a totally different person having been born in West Africa than I would have been. My parents were Scottish. Had I been born in Edinburgh or Aberdeen or somewhere like that.
But the sense of observance that you bring to 20th century Britain seems to me the product of being a slightly outsider. Nothing is taken for granted. You record and note everything. Yes,
I think you're absolutely right, and maybe that's a good thing for a novelist. I was an outsider in Africa as a white boy in a black African country, even though this is the extraordinary thing about West Africa, because there's not any racial tension at all. If I'd been born in Kenya or the then Rhodesia, or let alone South Africa, my experience of an African life would have been entirely different. But in West Africa, there was no white settler class. There was no second or third or fourth generation of white settlers. So the country was totally integrated, and as a kid, I could go anywhere fearlessly, which is an extraordinary gift. Couldn't do it now, no. But in those days, I just roved through the towns and the countryside, unconscious of any kind of animus or tension. And so that, I think, distinguishes those of us who grew up in West African countries from East and South African countries.
And in Sweet Caress, 8-year-old Amory is quite clearly on the road to being a photographer. Was 8-year-old William on the road to becoming a writer?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't come from a family of writers. I didn't meet my first writer until I went to university.
Were you studying literature?
Yes, I was always on the arts side. My mother was a teacher, taught French in Nigerian schools, and my father was a doctor. And I come from a family of solid middle-class Scottish professionals, where the work ethic is drilled into you from the cradle, and but nothing particularly artistic. And I don't really know why I ignored my father's advice consistently, and was always, did arts at school, English, history, French, that sort of thing. And at one stage, I wanted to go to art school, and he absolutely forbade that. So I think I had this, inclination to be some kind of an artist. I put it as vaguely as that. I think I must have seen a film somewhere, or where this guy was sitting at a typewriter, and he, got up from his typewriter and mixed himself a drink and stepped out onto a terrace and looked out. And I thought, that is the life for me. Because I don't know where I got it from otherwise. But
do you remember the process of writing your first fiction?
Yes, when I was at school, I ran the literary society, and I wrote, very bad, pretentious poems, as everybody does. But I had a kind of gap year before there were gap years, and I'd been at this Scottish boarding school for 10 years nearly, and I said to my father, I can't go straight on to university, I have to have some time off. And he said, well, you can have time off, but you have to do something useful. Scottish Calvinistic work. And so I went to a French university for a year in Nice, and I did a diploma course in French studies, but actually I was living and re-educating myself after 10 years in a single-sex boarding school in the north, and meeting, Europeans, and learning to speak French.
These
and
are
changing.
Formative experiences for a young man.
Totally formative. I've written short stories about it, actually. That's when I started writing. And I think that's when I thought maybe I could be a novelist. But, I had no idea what that meant and how you set about doing it. And nowadays, of course, there are any number of books and courses and, universities churning out people with degrees in creative writing. But in those days, I didn't know anybody who could tell me what to do. So it was a process of discovery. And it began when I went to university and continued thereafter. But I started writing little kind of scraps of fiction and observation in that year in Nice when I was 18 or 19. So the ambition had formed, but it was it was wishful thinking of the most extreme degree.
The thing that strikes me as so rare and wonderful about your work is this mixture of fact and fiction. So it's clearly fiction. These are stories about made-up characters, but there's often real people in them. And Sweet Caress is fascinating in that, I don't know, when you buy your copy for William to sign on the way out, you'll be able to see. But there's all these amazing old photographs all the way through, because Anne-Marie is a photographer, so it's such an important part of her life. So I wanted to ask about this mix of fiction and fact. How do you see that working on the page?
Well, I think I'm basically a realistic novelist, first and foremost, in the way that you can be a figurative painter or an abstract painter. I'm not a magic realist novelist. I'm not an experimentalist. I want to write novels that seem absolutely real, that when you open the book, you enter the world of the novel and you believe in it wholeheartedly. Well, and this requires a certain amount of effort to make the world of the novel seem living and breathing and authentic, particularly if it's set in the past. So there is that initial ambition that you want your novel to seem true to life. And if I'm writing about a young scientist woman studying chimpanzees in the wild, then I have to make sure that world comes alive and feels palpable and plausible. But over the years, it's not been a program at all, but I've realized now, looking back at my work with hindsight, that I've been constantly trying to push fiction into the world of the real, which so dominates us now with 24-hour rolling news and the internet and et cetera, But I think fiction is the most effective way of describing our lives and the human condition. It's the best art form. And I think I began to feel that the more you forgot it was fiction, the more powerful it would be. And this process started in 1987 when I wrote a novel called The New Confessions, which is in the form of a fake autobiography by a filmmaker, Scottish filmmaker born in 1899. You follow his life through to his old age in the 1970s. But it's meant to seem like the autobiography of a forgotten man. And of course, he is forgotten, this character. And one of the reviewers said, when I was reading the book, New Confessions, I found myself unreflectingly riffling through the pages looking for the photographs. And I thought, oh, I missed a trick there. And I had this idea that actually, to make the fiction more real, I could bring in the baggage of non-fiction. And I could make the books I was going to write seem so real that the fictive element would disappear. And the next book I wrote was my very short novel. I call it a novel because it's haunted my life ever since I wrote it. Nat Tate, an American painter.
This is a fantastic story. I was going to ask you, please.
Which became a kind of famous hoax. If you Google Nat Tate, you'll see the most extraordinary stuff about it.
So whose idea was Nat Tate originally?
Well, it was my idea, and I was this idea of photographs in fiction was beginning to obsess me. And I was working at the time on the editorial board of a very serious art magazine called Modern Painters. It came out 4 times a year, glossy, highly illustrated. And the editor said one day, how do I get fiction into a magazine like this? And I stuck up my hand this week and said, why don't I invent a painter? And she said, good idea. And so I invented this painter called Nat Tate, who was an American painter, born in 1928, committed suicide in 1960. Destroyed 99% of his work before he died, which is why none of you have ever heard of him. And then my co-editorial board member happened to be the rock icon David Bowie. I'm not joking. David is a side of his life that he kept kind of undercover, but we both joined the editorial board at the same time of this magazine, so we got to know each other. And never in my wildest dreams did I think I would be sitting beside David Bowie and saying, David, could you pass the salt, please? But anyway, I did, and I came to know him quite well in the 90s and the early 2000s. But he was also a publisher, Bowie. He had a little publishing house called 21 Publishing. And he said, why don't we publish Nat Tate as a little book, a little monograph, a coffee table book? And so I thought, photographs, here's my chance. And so I tricked out this book with many photographs, some of real people like Picasso and Georges Braque and various others, but also lots of anonymous photographs that I had bought in junk shops or car boot sales or whatever. And I appropriated them into the fiction of Nat Tate. I identified the people in the photographs, and I gave them captions. And so the book looks like it's a beautiful little book. I don't know if it's still in print, published by Bloomsbury, but it's a beautiful book that looks like a little memoir of a painter.
And did the name Nat Tate not give it away for anybody?
Well, nobody believes it. People think I chose the 2 big galleries in London, National Gallery and Tate Gallery, to signal that this was a hoax. But I didn't. But of course, maybe subconsciously I did. I just thought it was a good name. It sounded a good name for an American painter, Nat Tate. And so the book was published. I'll rattle through the story of the hoax. The book was published, and Bowie thought, let's have a lavish launch party. And he wrote the blurb of the book, another first, in which he claims to own a Nat Tate. It's a very elaborate hoax, but I won't go into the detail. I roped in other people real people who remembered meeting Nat Tate. So it was a very convincing hoax. And Bowie, at this party, which was in Manhattan, on April Fool's Day, 1998, it's 18 years ago, it was in the studio of Jeff Koons, the artist, who's a friend of Bowie's. So
of course,
everybody came. It's one of these legendary parties. Brad Pitt was there. I never saw him, But anyway, all sort of New York literati were there, and Bowie read extracts from this book, Deadpan. But one of the conspirators in the hoax was an English journalist, a malicious English journalist, and he went round the assembled New York literati asking questions about Nat Tate. And of course, people being people said, yeah, isn't it a tragedy he died so young? And I think I remember a show in Philadelphia, and they dug their graves and jumped in. And we were, not to denigrate the good folk of Manhattan, we were about to do the same thing in London a week later. Another big party, all the young British artists coming to it, and I had done many interviews with eminent British journalists telling about this forgotten American painter I discovered. But the journalist realized he had a story that was too good to sit on, and so he blew it wide open 3 days after the launch, in the independent newspaper. And for 24 hours, it became a global news story. To my vague annoyance, because I wanted it to be more of a slow burn, but it detonated as this, British novelist hoaxes Manhattan art world was a headline in the Independent. But how many people were hoaxed and for how long? But people love a hoax, and so it's endured. 18 years, still going on. We've made 3 television documentaries about Nat Tate. The book has been translated into French, Spanish, and German. And he's become my Frankenstein's monster. I know when I die, I'll be remembered for Nat Tate and having written a few novels as well. But it's, and then I decided to bring a halt to it all because it was getting out of control. I thought I was in a German art gallery in Berlin. A big crowd like this, and behind me was a 20-foot portrait of the only surviving photograph of Nat Tate. And I was talking to this art critic in all seriousness about Nat's work, and I thought, this is ridiculous, it's got to stop. I'll sell a Nat Tate at auction at Sotheby's in London. And so we did. We sold a little drawing of Nat Tate, because I do all the work, with a 2-page note, and everybody knew it was a fake because the hoax had been exposed, and we sold it for £7,500. Went to charity, not to me, but it hasn't ended, and it rumbles on. But come back after this long digression to what it showed me was that something that was utterly fictitious could be perceived as totally real, and in a way my program of pushing fiction into the world of the real, and like a cannibal eating the brain of my enemy to make me stronger, worked. And so I then wrote Any Human Heart and Sweet Caress, which are all books that are doing the same thing, something that's signaled as a novel.
Yes.
But in fact, the experience of reading it, I think, is the experience of reading the story of a life that was actually lived. And it's a very curious effect that these books have.
And that is a really good point for us to actually speak more specifically about Sweet Caress, because it is pretty much the whole of one remarkable woman's life over the course of the 20th century. So starting from when she was 8 and receiving her first camera, and until pretty much her death, but she's present at an enormous amount of significant events in the 20th century, and she does meet famous people. There's a few little cameos. Yes. Can we talk about the wars that she's involved in? Are pretty significant, not just to the history of her, but to the history of all of us. Can we talk about war and its role in this book?
Yes, I think, again, it goes back to Africa, because I was living in Nigeria in the late 1960s when the Nigerian Civil War was on. The Biafran War, as it's known, was sort of another forgotten war of the 20th century. But it had a profound effect on me. I was in my late teens, and I knew people in the Biafran army, and living in a country that's undergoing a savage civil war, 1 million people died in the Biafran War, was profoundly upsetting and destabilizing, because what I was seeing, I was far from the fighting, but you were stopped at roadblocks and guns were pointed at you in order. So I said, this is nothing like the movies. This is nothing like fiction. And so I've written about war a lot, and I think it's because of that experience that showed me the reality of any conflict is in a way far removed from the way it's presented to us artistically. I think there's something's gone wrong.
There's actually a moment in the book that this is perfectly captured, where Amory is caught up in her first proper battle, and she takes a photo of, just coincidentally, it's almost reflex, and she's shaking and in shock, but she snaps her camera at the moment a soldier dies.
Yes.
And she's struck by how mundane it is, how it's not dramatic with his arms flown out. It's the bullet enters him and he looks just vaguely perplexed, and then he just falls. And it's the line, something about they fall like a sack of potatoes always.
Yes, yes.
And the very mundane nature of these deaths as opposed to the artistic representation we see.
Yes, and in a way it's a kind of commentary on that most famous photograph called Falling Soldier by Robert Capa, which I think everybody now agrees was faked. But it's of a soldier in the Spanish Civil War, you'll know it, I'm sure, whose Capa claimed to have caught him at the moment of his death, where his arms are flung wide, he's got a rifle in one hand, and it made Capa's reputation. But he then, whether he did this deliberately or guilelessly, he then took a photograph of the dead soldier lying on the ground, but the background is totally different. So he'd obviously said to the guy, lie over there and pretend to be dead.
Right.
So in a way, he perpetuated the myth that when people are hit by a bullet, they die as they do in the movies. But in fact, if you read carefully or talk to soldiers who've witnessed it, they do go down like a sack of potatoes. Mm-hmm. So it's a commentary on the photography, but also the reality of how the banality of war is as striking as its horror. And Amory, one of the themes of the novel is the ripple effect of wars in the 20th century, and how it's not just the soldiers on the battlefield that are victims, but also the families. And Amory's father is traumatized by his experiences in World War I. That kind of drives him mad, and her brother and her husband are also massively affected, and of course thereby so is she. And so it's about the knock-on effect, the domino effect of wars in our lives and how they touch us, and particularly the great wars of the 20th century, which I think as we leave the 20th century further and further behind, and you look at World War I and World War II, and they seem to me more and more the defining events of the century, and we're still living with their consequences. Yes. Hugely. So I find myself writing about them again and again because of my peripheral connection with this one little horrible civil war in Africa, but also, my grandfather and great uncle survived World War I in the trenches, and my father and his 6 brothers survived World War II. So it's not ancient history, it's part of my family history as well. And I see the effect of these wars, and from another angle, you can see that, in a way, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 ruined the rest of the 20th century, but and the 21st. But it's so there's a kind of historical hindsight, wisdom of hindsight there. But on a more personal level, it's what's it like, and what's the reality? And I think you have a responsibility as a serious novelist to try and get that reality down on the page.
In the acknowledgements at the end, you list a number of very famous female war photographers. And did you draw on their lives as for Amory?
I did, actually. I mean, when I decided, I wanted to write the whole life of a woman, as you said, Tony. And when you get that idea, which is the glimmer of an idea for a novel, what happens with me, I don't know if it happens with you, but what I then spent about 2 years figuring it out, and that figuring out is a long Q&A session when I ask myself a question, what's her name? when's she born? And that the answer to those questions trigger more questions, and slowly an aggregate of information begins to.
And are you writing these down? Are you
Yeah,
taking
right.
notes?
Filling notebooks and
Yep.
thinking, oh, I'll have to research that or travel there, and gradually a narrative begins to emerge. But it's a long Q&A session. One of the first questions was, what does she do? And I thought, I'll make her a photographer. And one of the revelations of researching the novel was just how many women photographers there had been in the 20th century who are completely forgotten, particularly between the two wars. And the funny thing about photography as a profession, it was totally egalitarian from the outset. You could be a very successful woman photographer or a very successful male photographer. And somehow the profession, maybe because it was so new, didn't have any glass ceilings in place. And so many of the women I list in the little section of acknowledgements at the back, if you're an expert on photography, you'll know, but most people have never heard of them, but they're brilliant photographers. So it was a kind of uncovering, as I said, of a sort of lost sorority of women photographers whose work was exceptional. And so I cherry-picked bits of their lives for Amory's life, and she's a sort of amalgam of them all.
Some of the parts are so incredibly vivid. The part where, I'm not giving away any spoilers here, ladies and gentlemen, but she's a war photographer, so she goes to Vietnam as well. And it's incredibly vivid as she's there. Do you have to go to these places to put that in?
Well, I pondered going to Vietnam, but I've discovered when I was a poor young novelist and I wanted to go to places, I couldn't afford to go. So I used to send my imagination, and actually, in a funny sort of way, it's better because you can do too much research.
Yes.
I wrote a novel called The Blue Afternoon, which is narrated by a woman, the story of her father's life, and it's set in the Philippines in 1902. And I was going to go to the Philippines, but I think a volcano erupted and all flights were banned for a while, and so I thought, no, this is a sign, don't go, send your imagination. And anyway, the Philippines, Manila of 1902 doesn't exist anymore, but I got this letter from the head of J. Walter Thompson, the advertising agency in Manila, after the book came out, saying, "Dear Mr. Boyd, I thought you might like to know that every new client we get here at J. Walter Thompson, Manila, we give them a copy of your book to tell them something of the story of our wonderful country and its a complex history. When did you live in Manila, and how long did?" So, you don't need to go. I didn't go to Vietnam. Your imagination is actually a very good virtual traveler. But also, it was more the Vietnam War, which I think, again, is receding into obscurity, which I remember vividly, which I wanted to revisit in fiction. And, of course, it fitted Amory's timescale of her life as a professional photographer. And actually, it was the war for photographers. I think neither before nor since have photographers and journalists been so free to cover a conflict. In the British Army in the First World War, for the first 2 years, no photographers were allowed in the front line. It's only in 1916 that we start getting photographs of the British trenches.
Right.
And so that kind of control by armies has existed for a long time, but somehow in Vietnam, all you needed was accreditation, and you could pack your camera and go. And in a way, the argument is that the photographers and the television reportage and the journalism brought about the end of the war, and armies wised up and said, we mustn't let these guys and gals go there again, and now you're embedded and controlled and censored and so on. But that war, it was in a way, it was a horrible experience, of course, but for photographers, they had a liberty to roam the battlefields that has never been encountered since.
And where did you get these amazing photos? Like, there's quite a substantial photo of it's in the book. It's used to be a secret German tank in World War II, and she is very brave to get this photograph and has to hide the film in her bra, I think it is, so that it's not taken away from her. Where do you find these photos?
Well, They're all anonymous. There are 73 photographs in this novel, which novelists have used photographs before, but I don't think anybody's ever put 73. And half a dozen, was considered, audacious enough. But they're all anonymous, and I bought them in junk shops and in antique fairs in French country villages. I bought a lot of them online. They're very cheap. Anonymous photographs, and I'd written the novel first, so I knew what I was looking for. Right. Amory goes to Berlin in the 1920s, so I was looking for photographs of Berlin nightlife in the 1920s, and we know she goes to Vietnam. They were the hardest to find because most photographs of Vietnam are press photographs, and so they have a provenance. And I wanted snapshots taken by GIs, and they were very difficult to find, but I found some really fantastic ones, I think. But I bought them, either in, I bought two plastic bags full of about 400 photographs from Vietnam that had been cleared out of a house. Maybe some old vet had died, and his stuff was being sold off. And I found 2 or 3 great shots amongst the 400. As I say, I bought 2,000 photographs approximately, and from that I selected my 73. No, they're out there, and actually people are beginning to collect anonymous photographs now, because that's a wonderful thing about photography. We're all capable of taking a great photograph. We can't all write a symphony or a novel or paint a wonderful picture, but we, thanks to the properties of the wonderful machine, we can, with a bit of luck, take a fantastic photograph. It's the most democratic art form. And I found amazing photographs which were anonymous. In fact, the one that's the frontispiece of the you can't see it, but if you on the very first photograph, which is a picture purportedly of Amory Clay in 1928.
You won't be able to see it, but she's in a swimsuit.
Standing in a pond, posing.
It's really lovely.
That photograph was actually found in Dulwich, East London, on the ground by a bus stop, by a friend of mine who was waiting for a bus. And he looked down on the ground. It's a tiny photograph. It's only about 2 inches by 1 inch. And he found this phone. He picked it up, and he realized it was an old photograph, because you can tell from her swimsuit it must be the 1920s. And he sent it to me because he knew about Nat Tate, and he knew I was interested in anonymous photographs. And it came in the post, and I said, that's Amory. The gods of photography had smiled on me and dropped this photograph at a bus stop in Dulwich to be picked up by a friend of mine. So it was literally found in the street, and many of the others were just, thrown away family albums that I flicked through and found a perfect photograph for my purposes, because I knew what I was looking for. And occasionally I'd find one that was so good that I had to make a slight swerve in the narrative so that it could be incorporated. But the funny thing is that, and I was worried a bit, that I thought, if I have so many photographs in the book, which are entirely justified by the fact she's a photographer, will it detract from the prose? But it's a very curious thing. It enhances the fiction. And it's this same process of making something that you know in your head is a fiction seem real. You read about Amory lives in a cottage on a small island off the west coast of Scotland, and you read about this cottage, you turn the page, and there's a photograph of it. And it's somehow like, oh, what a nice cottage. And it somehow makes what you've read seem incredibly concrete. And I'm expecting to see a few more novels with photographs in there.
Everything is so completely concrete. The other thing I must confess that I did is Google her brother to see if he was really a poet.
Yes.
Did you write the poem yourself?
Yes, I mean, her brother, who's called Zan Clay, writes poems which he calls vertical poems, which are one word per line, or 2 words per line. And I actually wrote 20 vertical poems by Zan Clay, which I reproduced 3, I think, in the book. So the frustrated poet, I think, as well as a frustrated artist. But No, I think that it's in the list of acknowledgements at the back. Some of the names are fictional names, so beware.
There's layers upon layers here, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the final question I wanted to ask about this book, the layers of the characters and the way they interact. Because it's a very difficult time for Britain in a lot of this book, in the history of the 20th century. And they are very stiff upper lip kind of people. So that the things that they think and the way that they express themselves does not always represent the emotional turmoil that's underneath. So there's one moment where Avery gets terrible news from a doctor, and the doctor delivers her this terrible news, and she says, "Right, now I felt tears prickle at the corners of my eyes." She says, "I'll have to think about that, take it on board." "Yes, of course," says the doctor, "and now I really must go for my train." He shook my hand formally and left. So this terrible news is delivered in this very serious fashion, and she says, I'll take it on board. But we still have this sense of everything that's going on under the surface. And I found that at a number of points where these really great emotional points are covered by the stiffness of the time, I suppose. But as a reader, I felt myself just being drawn into feeling for her.
Yes, and I think it's in a way a reflection of the era she lived through, and I think that it may be a very British thing, keep your emotions in check. And of course she grows up in a family where her mother's constant injunction is don't make a fuss, So she's, and again, what happens to her as a young girl, so again a terrible trauma which she survives, in a way affects the way she looks at her life. So
Absolutely.
I think, everybody's different, and but I think that it is a very British thing. It's not an English thing. Mm-hmm. There's a Scottish equivalent of it as well. It's a very English thing not to make a fuss. Oh dear, my leg's been blown off. We call it famous unconcern, and it's still very much part, I think, of the national psyche. But if you prick us, we will bleed, as Shylock said. There is a tremendous amount of emotional heft going on, but the expression
Absolutely.
of it is particularly in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Nowadays we can beat our breasts and wail with the best of them. But I think in that era, and I think that's probably the generation of my parents, it was regarded as slightly bad form to show your emotions strongly. And you come across it again and again in memoirs and in the novels of the time, and you still see it in British society. I think there's a sense in which maybe "don't make a fuss" is our national motto, but no, it's politesse. It's how you behave in society. An eminent surgeon delivers you shockingly bad news, and you say, "Thank you so much. I do hope you don't miss your train." And that's sort of understood. The subtext of the discussion is never really alluded to.
I have one more question for him, which was, maybe it's not just Nat Tate you'll be particularly remembered for, but can you tell us about your Bond book?
Oh yes, my James Bond novel, Solo. I had finished a novel, which was actually it was a spy novel, but it's called Waiting for Sunrise, which is set in World War I. And I'd written a lot about Ian Fleming. I'd even put him as a character in Any Human Heart. And I'd written articles about Ian Fleming, and suddenly I got a call from my agent saying, sit down, take a deep breath, but would you be interested in writing a James Bond novel? Beat. Yes. And the family, the Ian Fleming's family, who control the literary estate, they have nothing to do with the Bond movies, have commissioned many of these so-called continuation novels. But there's a new series where they're asking, more serious novelists to write a James Bond novel. They give you the gift of the character, and leave it up to you. And so I thought, this is, what a great job. And I've written, I write to commission all the time because I write lots of films, and somebody says, do you want to write a film about Charlie Chaplin? Yes, please. So in a way, it wasn't such a shock to me as it might be to other novelists to think, oh no, I can't take somebody else's character and write a novel about it. It just seemed to me a very interesting job to do. So, and because I knew so much about Ian Fleming, a very strange man, talk about famous unconcern, who committed slow suicide, I think, but died age 56. But I thought this is a wonderful opportunity, so I reread all the Bond novels and the various short stories that Fleming had written in chronological order, taking notes, and became a kind of instant pseudo-Bond expert. And I wrote my Bond novel, setting it 5 years after the last one that Fleming wrote, which was The Man with the Golden Gun, which was 1964. Fleming died before it was published, in fact. And set my novel in 1969, when Bond is 45, a middle-aged man, middle-aged spy, and in swinging London. And set him down in Africa with no gadgets, unaccommodated man. And it was an attempt, having read my way through the Fleming canon, to produce a portrait of this mythic figure. Because in my novel, unusually, because Fleming doesn't do this, you never leave Bond's point of view. Mm-hmm. You see everything through his eyes. And so in a way, it's a classic Bond story. There are two fabulous love affairs, a hideous villain, lots of cars and eating and drinking and smoking. But it's actually a portrait of this figure that we know, or we think we know because of the movies, which are entirely different from Fleming's Bond. And everything in my novel, however odd it may seem, has its source in Fleming. And even, for example, in my novel, there's a footnote where Bond gives you, the readers, his recipe for vinaigrette dressing. And you might think, hang on, this is a James Bond novel. But actually, Fleming did exactly the same in a short story he wrote about Bond, where Bond, in a footnote, gives his recipe for the perfect scrambled eggs. So I thought, well, if it's good enough for Fleming, it's good enough. So it's that sort of thing. I had tremendous fun writing this novel, which I think is exciting and really interesting, because it's not fantastical. It's very real. Surprise, surprise. But it is a portrait of Bond, which I hope Fleming would approve of.
Fantastic. Hello, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Boyd. Thank you for coming to Melbourne. I've loved all your books, and it's just intrigued. In your earlier books, you did themes like architecture and anthropology, and to coin your own words, I become a pseudo-expert in those subjects, having read them. Have you got any other major themes that you want to write about?
Well, I'm not doing this deliberately, but I realize I am sort of working my way through the arts, having written a novel about a filmmaker, a novel about a novelist, now a photographer. Nat Tate was a painter. And I'll give you a scoop. My next novel, which I'm dreaming up at the moment, is going to be about music. Oops. Yes, I'm beginning to have some. No, I've got a very interesting angle on it. Don't worry. I like everybody. I love music. I'm very interested in the lives of musicians. So I just had this idea, and that's the world I'm venturing into next.
Thank you, sir. Here, yes.
Could you say something about the Range Rover book?
Sorry, what?
The Range Rover book.
Oh, yes. Well, it wasn't a book. Again, it's a commissioned work. I'm a jobbing writer, so when somebody comes along and offers to pay me some money to do some writing, I think seriously about it. But again, another strange commission. An advertising agency in America who represented Land Rover USA came up with this advertising campaign, which was meant to break the mold of all advertising campaigns. You know, you've got a car, what do? Stick a picture of the car on a billboard, or have fancy, advert shot with the car speeding through the streets or whatever. And they thought, let's not do this. They said, let's write a piece of fiction, an adventure. That's all they said, adventure. And they said, would you write a long short story that was an adventure in the sort of John Buchan sense, and in it, all you have to do is mention the word Land Rover once. And I thought, I can do that. And it was a generous payday, I have to say. But so I wrote this story, which I called The Vanishing Game, which is again a kind of carryover from the novel I wrote, Waiting for Sunrise, which is the central character is an actor. And again, I've worked a lot with actors, and a lot of my very best friends are actors, and I'm very that's another thing I've done, written about actors. So the theatre has been another one to tick off. So I had written this novel about an actor who becomes a spy, and so I wrote this adventure about an actor who becomes embroiled in a conspiracy that he doesn't really understand. But in the course of this conspiracy, he has to drive an old Land Rover from London to Scotland. So that got rid of the Land Rover aspect. But the story is actually has been available online. And what this advertising company did, that once I'd finished it, they wrote a musical score for it, and they shot scenes from it. And so that the website, if you Google William Boyd, The Vanishing Game, you can access it. I think it is maybe more people will do it. It's a unique reading experience because, like reading you read the text of the book on your computer, but at the same time you're hearing the soundtrack. What's the soundtrack to a novel? And you're hearing, the wind blew through the trees, and occasionally you'll see filmed but mute scenes from the novel. He walked into the pub and ordered a whiskey, and there's somebody walks. So as a reading experience, it's quite astonishing, and cost them a fortune, I think. But they've won tons of prizes for their advertising campaign. But my role in that was to write the story, and it's a 17,000-word short story. It's the longest short story I've ever written. It's almost a novella, in fact. But I'm bringing out my next book is actually going to be a collection of short stories, which will be out next year. And in that collection, you'll be able to read The Vanishing Game as an orthodox short story. But the web internet version still exists, and it really is mold-breaking, I think. It's quite astonishing multi-sense experience.
Thank you. There was a gentleman just behind you, actually. Yep, there. Thank you.
Good evening. From Bond to dogs, there's a passage in Any Human Heart, having been a dog owner that lost his 18-year-old recently, that I've shared with other friends that is just so incredibly moving. And I'll just read a little bit. She's only an old dog, I tell myself, but what makes me unutterably sad is that with her gone, so the love of my life has gone. It may sound stupid, but I loved her, and she loved me. That meant there was an uncomplicated traffic of mutual love in my life, and I find it hard to admit that it's gone forever. I just wanted to ask, because that is so ineffably true and moving, have you had a dog and gone through that experience?
No, believe it or not.
That's really?
It's
because it's in here too.
I know, but actually you could write a PhD thesis on dogs in the work of William Boyd, I think, because I keep bringing dogs into my... I mean, I'm a dog lover, but because I grew up in Africa, we never had a dog in our family because of the risk of rabies, and which was everywhere. And so actually in Africa, when you saw a dog, you used to throw a stone at it because you were worried it might be rabid. That's how one of the extraordinary things about growing up in Africa. But I've never owned a dog, and but I understand that uncomplicated traffic of love between an owner and his or her pet. And for some reason, I don't know why, maybe some psychiatrist can explain it to me, but that dogs figure in my work a lot.
I wish I could find the passage. I won't flick through it now.
But she has 2 dogs.
Yes, and one of them is ill, and she has to give it a tablet, and it's incredibly moving. This act of
Amory
caring.
has 2 Labradors, one called Flim, and Flim dies, and then she gets another one called Flam. So, and there's a picture of Flam in there as well. So, I don't know. I think it's maybe I know dog lovers and I observe them, but it's another example of using your imagination. And I think that novel writing at a very fundamental level, and I'm sure you agree with this, Tony, is a liberation of your imagination. You can't, or I'm not the sort of writer who's experienced, maybe 80% of the things I write about.
But it's not. It's also the duty of the imagination, isn't it? It's the responsibility.
Yes, you have to make. I mean, I've never gone over the top in a First World War battle. Clearly, I've never been a woman either. But actually, I've written 4 novels from the point of view of a woman, and similarly, I've never owned a dog. But I can imagine, and one should say that in Any Human Heart, Logan Mountstuart, the central character, has had a very hard time, and his dog Bowser has been a staunch companion. So when Bowser goes to the dog heaven, it's a terrible moment for him. But if you have to have a fully functioning imagination to be a novelist, and there are no bounds to what you can imagine. Sure. I mean, I've never killed anybody, you'll be glad to hear, but I've killed lots of people in my novels, and so or been shot, but. In my James Bond novel, Bond gets almost fatally shot.
Have you ever been a spy, William? Come on.
No, I haven't been a spy, but I think novelists are a bit like spies. We're always listening and looking and picking up clues, and I think novelists see the world as a spy sees the world. I mean, a spy is looking at the world with incredible intensity, either to get information or either to protect him or herself. They notice everything, and I think novelists notice everything as well.
On that note, lady, have we got time for one more question? We've got time for one more question. Thank you.
Yes, I've enjoyed your books and also the characters. I was wondering if you ever think about going back to characters you've created in earlier books.
Well, it's funny. I've occasionally thought of writing a sequel to certain novels. I've even thought of writing a sequel to my first novel, A Good Man in Africa, which the central character is a diplomat, a drunken, overweight British diplomat. And I thought of writing a sequel where I'd send him to Washington, D.C. at the time of the Watergate scandal, and he would be Deep Throat. But
excellent.
But I have, in my short stories, written sequences of stories in which the same character reappears. There are 3 characters who have reappeared in many of my short stories. One is called Edward Scully, who is a kind of evil twin of me, sort of does the same things that I have done, but is a much nastier person. And I've written a sequence of short stories which will be out in this new collection, 10 short stories about a 23-year-old girl living in London called Bethany Melmoth. And I've also written about 2 or 3 short stories about a very elderly novelist in his 80s called Eve Hill. So there's something in my imagination that makes me want to write sequels, but I've never been or had the nerve to do it for a novel, because I think if the sequel is really good, then that diminishes the original. But if the sequel is indifferent, then why bother? Mm-hmm. So it's a challenge, but I do see there's obviously something that makes me want to write about the same character again and again, and I have done, but in my short fiction.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sweet Caress is not just a fantastic story of Amory, the war photographer. It's an amazing history of war throughout the 20th century, and it's a fascinating look at the things that have brought our world to the point it is at today. But in the meantime, can you please join with me in thanking William Boyd?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.